Now, when we talk about FATFreq, when it first introduced all of its ranges, everybody was like, what the hell are they doing? What's wrong with the graph? Why is there such a concussive amount of bass? And after listening to this, it's not what you think. Now, before we begin, just want to apologize and also say thank you to my friend Chuntat, the original guy who actually borrowed me his Mona for a day to review. He has upgraded to this and, kind of benched his Mona Mark II, and I could kind of understand why. Now, FATFreq is a company based in Singapore, and if you have been watching some videos from Krin, you definitely know that they started off with modding stuff as well. And things get a little bit funny where they try their best to do something that's egregious. But despite looking at the graph and knowing that it has almost 20 dBs of sub bass, honestly it does not really feel that much, which we'll get into in a minute. But first, let's talk a little bit about some nuances of this thing. The first thing is definitely the fact that you could technically upgrade your cables to another pair, but the stock cable in general is this. Mainly because, this thing was being catered towards professional use, towards stage use, and they need to use this type of cable to reduce any form of microphonics. And second of all, it really needs a lot of power. Like when I'm directly plugging it into my Mac, the problem with it is that the bass does not really, come out as much. The bass is definitely there. The problem is that the texture is a little bit missing. It doesn't really resolve as much. Compare that to using my Kensei, that solves it all. But just to give you an idea on how much this thing consumes in terms of power, my Kensei needs to be at least at 80% for me to feel like I'm listening at a normal volume. Anything below that, I feel like it's not enough. And one little gripe about the Maestro Mini is regarding the fit. I like the fact that this thing is so small in size that when I'm wearing it and when I'm sleeping with it, like when we sleep, we tend to roll our heads left and right. The problem with every other IEMs is that the head shelves are too big. This thing is small enough to not even make me remember I have IEMs on. Like, I shit you not. It is that good. But one little thing that I don't like is that this thing has some slight driver flex. It's not really that significant early on, but then after like an hour of listening, you do feel like your ears are a little bit pressurized and you need to like take it out just to relieve it a little bit. But regardless of all that, this thing overall still sounds great. I'll just show you the graph and let's talk about the sound. Now, in general, I am actually gonna go against the grain compared to like probably other reviewers saying that this is probably a V-shaped IEM. I feel like this is more balanced than V-shaped, but it is balanced to neutral with a very significant bass boost, if it makes any sense. Now, the thing about the FATFreq Maestro Mini is that it has very good mids and highs, but it is not subdued by the extreme amounts of bass. Like, honestly, for the bass region, starting off with the bass right now, sub bass is definitely one of the strongest that I've heard in terms of amplitude. But despite it being so much, despite it shown on the graph having 20 dB, I don't think it's that much. It's just maybe slightly more than the Moondrop variations by a bit. Okay, maybe not slightly, but you get what I mean. Even though the bass is that much, the thing about this whole thing is that this is the most defined and pleasing type of sub bass that I've actually heard. Like, rumbles are not rumbles. They are actually textured. Like, whatever I hear from now on really does not favor compared to what I hear in the Maestro Minis, which, will probably translate even more towards their whole lineup. The sub bass, I know some people are referring to it like having a subwoofer. I could kind of relate to that. It sort of is like that. 808s, in terms of the rumbles, overall, you do feel like it is dark. You do feel like it's thumpy, but it presents itself with textures that honestly I've never heard before. Like, it is very clear. You will feel like it's very weird saying that bass is clear, but this bass is very clear. And rumble sounds in general are definitely very natural and organic. I don't really have another way to say it, but it does not sound warm. It just sounds very natural in this sense. And lower bass and mid bass in general, I would say is a little bit subdued by the fact that the sub bass is a little bit too much, but overall it could still possess an amazing amount of texture and detail. Now when you're listening to fast licks, I'll just use Into the Night by Yoasobi. as a best example. The starting bass lick, for usual pairs of IEMs, you could definitely hear everything very clearly, but for this one you could feel like it's all subdued by the sub bass. It's a little bit too much in very certain areas for very certain tracks. But regardless of that, hip-hop, R&B, instrumentals, all of this sounds quite nice. And considering the fact that currently, as of filming this is around $500 US, there is no bass bleed into the mids and the highs, which is what we expected. And definitely segueing on to the mids, talking about vocals. Now, vocal texture for males and females are very specific right now. You do expect something like this to have recessed vocals, but honestly, even when I'm not using the Kensei, when I'm just trying it on directly into my M3, it still sounds quite okay. It is still, I wouldn't say recessed, I would say the Z1R is even slightly recessed than this thing. You could say this thing is more forward than the Z1R. And in terms of the texture for both male and female vocals, for some reason, you could feel like it's more crispy than what you could usually listen to. Like, it honestly feels quite crispy. Tone might be on the slightly neutral / cold-ish side, considering that this pair, honestly, despite the amounts of bass, the texture probably gives away that this thing is a very, very analytical pair on first impression. And on the instruments end, everything sounds lighter, everything sounds more energetic, but for some reason I feel like overtones might be a little bit too harsh in terms of the the release. Again, just going off of a tangent for mixing, y'all know attack, sustain, delay, release, ASDR. The release on everything, on all the overtones, are a little bit too fast. Like, basically the extension does not extend too much, so you wouldn't really expect this thing to sound very airy in the mids, but the amount of details actually compensate for everything. So we'll just talk about that later. And in general, I guess for some reason, when I listen to this, my impression might be leaning a little bit towards, maybe they have some slight ACG influence towards this when they're tuning this, because it does sound like they are catering towards stuff like that a little bit. Synths, pianos, all those sound light, but for some reason sound very, very digital for some reason. And definitely strings, all of those sounds a little bit post-processed. But nevertheless, that is just a colorization. It is not a flaw. It's just a feature, a characteristic of the FATFreq Maestro Mini. And going on to the treble, the same thing applies. The extension is honestly not that much, but you could feel like the amount of extension and the way that this thing presents itself to all of us when we're listening to it is very, very natural in terms of what we expect when we're listening to a live show. Realistically, if you're listening to a live show, there's not going to be that much decay over time in terms of, the rides overtones, the snares overtones, the hi-hats overtones. So everything from the drum side might sound a little bit dry, but forward enough to not garner any form of dullness. And maybe a little bit nitpick is that overall for the energy and the treble part, things might sound slightly anorexic. I don't really know how to describe this, but things are clear enough, things are resolving enough throughout the spectrum, but for the treble part, I really feel like something is missing just a little bit. Maybe they're lacking in a little bit of dynamics, because things might sound a little bit one-dimensional when, let's say, a single note is being hit. I don't hear some form of reverb, I don't hear some form of accompaniment of overtones that much. Like, that's probably the only gripe that I have when I'm listening to the Maestro Mini. But other than that, mainly we're just listening to the mids. Everything sounds good. Moving on to the technicalities, dynamics overall are quite good. There's nothing much to complain about, and this is very specific. When you're listening to low volumes and high volumes, the amount of bass does not change relative to the mids and the treble. Everything still sounds very crisp, very clear, very well balanced. Soundstage for $500 honestly is quite average for the price. I've tested it directly onto my M3 and honestly it is average. But definitely when you're plugging it into the Kensei, it really makes everything sound very, very spacious, very, very wide. Imaging and separation is honestly quite above its weight class. Separation in between the layers might be average, but I feel like this thing really excels a lot in pinpoint accuracy. Like, the imaging for very, very specific places are very, very tight. The tolerances are tighter than certain things where you feel like, oh, drums are in that area, instead of just saying drums are there, literally just there. And last but not least, detail retrieval. These things are really trying to define the market right here for what it's worth. They are able to accentuate overtones and micro details very, very good, and definitely is a very strong pair. But like I said, this thing has its own specialty. Overall, it sounds more analytical in terms of its detail rather than, being more approachable for some other people. The FATFreq Maestro Mini, in conclusion, is being made with the thought of maybe someone wants to use it for professional work. And I would see why. We do not want other types of ambiance, other types of extensions to actually cloud us. We want to hear everything that we play when we're doing playback, whether it's correct or not. But we just want that. That's it. We don't want to hear if something is decaying, this and that. You get what I mean. So overall, I would say the detail retrieval for this pair was being done quite well when you're given the context. But even without the context, this thing honestly slaps. Like, it has been a while since I feel like detail retrieval, instead of me just comparing, oh, how much amount of micro details and macro details these things are giving out. How does it present itself? How does it weigh itself with all of the main components? This thing is doing something different. This thing really sounds staccato. This thing sounds dry, but very clinical, very analytical. I quite like this pair a lot. All in all, the FATFreq Maestro Mini honestly is quite an interesting pair. Like, after listening to this, I would feel like, this is probably the best gateway to any of those graph believers to be like, stop comparing graphs, okay? Just take a listen and you'll get what we're talking about. You'll get what we mean. That's why most of us say don't look at graphs to actually paint a conclusion. Y'all actually need to listen to actually believe and actually build your own comments, build your own opinions, your thoughts. But anyways, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. This might be a little bit rushed, but hopefully I got all my thoughts out after using this for 3 days. I'm gonna go return the Maestro Mini to its rightful owner now. So thank you for watching. Have a good one.